In this video, I'm going to introduce two-dimensional graphing. We call it two-dimensional graphing because we're going to have two variables that we're putting on a grid. In this case, we're using x and y. You can use different letters, and we'll see that happen with different stuff we're doing, but kind of the normal boring thing that we do is use x and y. So I have a two-dimensional grid here, and basically what it's made up of is a number line for your x values, where for that number line, just ignore the y-axis for now, but for that number line, 0 would be in the middle. We count to the right for positive numbers and to the left for negative numbers. So if we only had that number line and I wanted to plot a 3, I would count over from 0 right 3 steps and put a point. And that would be actual one-dimensional graphing, as if we just had one variable. But in this case, we have two variables, so we intersect that number line with a second number line perpendicular to it. And for that number line, 0 is also in the middle. Going down is negative and going up is positive. And so if I was just looking at that number line and I wanted to plot a 5, I would go up 5 steps. Again, that's a one-dimensional way of plotting it. But if I want to do the two-dimensional way of plotting it, I would put the point where those two values correspond. So instead of putting any points on the number lines that I'm talking about, I would put them out where the 3 of the x and the 5 of the of the y come out and correspond. It's kind of like Battleship. I always liked that game growing up. So anyways, this point here represents when x is 3 and y is 5. So that's basically how the grid works. I'm going to erase all of this so we can talk about some of the formal language around how it works and kind of build the precise notation that we're supposed to be using. Alright, so first, this thing that I've been calling a number line for the x values, we actually call an x-axis. And similarly, for the number line for the y values, we call the y-axis. We don't really ever call them number lines, but that's what they are. And so the plural for that would be the axes. The x-axis is the horizontal axis, the y-axis is the vertical axis. And if you're using x and y's, that's always the case. And then the point of 0 in the middle here, I said that was 0 for y, and that's 0 for x, and that's really where we start our counting, right? You start counting with 0, and so we call that the origin, because it's where we start or originate our counting. Now when it comes to putting points on the graph, I'll go ahead and put that 3, 5 point back on the graph. And I said that corresponds to an x value of 3 and a y value of 5. The way we write that is using a notation called ordered pairs. Now, the reason why they're called ordered pairs is that the x always comes first and the y always comes second. So it's going to be an x, comma, y. No matter what number is written first, we assume that's the x. It just makes it a little bit more concise. And we wrap that in parentheses. So our point we have on the graph there would be 3, comma, 5. You have to have the comma and you have to have the parentheses. That's all a part of the notation. And by using that notation, whoever's reading it knows we're talking about a point and that the first number is the x and the second number is the y, just by convention of the notation. So that's how we represent locations on the graph. And with that, then the order pair that corresponds to our origin is the order pair 0, 0, because x is 0 at that point and the y is 0 at that point. Alright, now what I'm going to do is put a graph on the grid. So I'm just going to swoop a little, I'm going to make it blue here so it looks different than the other stuff. And notice what I said there, I'm putting a graph on the grid. The grid itself is not the graph. We put graphs on the grid. So here, this little blue curve is what I put on the grid. And I'm not representing that off of an equation or anything, I just made it up. to talk to you about two other points. There are this point here where it crosses the y-axis and the point where it crosses the x-axis. Those become important points in graph for various reasons that we'll discuss later. They have special names, so for now I just want to introduce you to their names. Where it crosses the x-axis is called the x-intercept. And where it crosses the y-axis is called the y-intercept. And these are really all the names I'm concerned about you knowing as far as the anatomy of two-dimensional graphing. There's other ones, but I'm not so concerned about those. These are the ones that I'm going to use a lot. You'll need to know so you understand what's coming out of my mouth, and also so that you can understand what a question is asking. I do want to caution you about something that I've noticed, just a behavior that I've noticed, is when we're talking about graphing, we'll talk about like an x-axis and an x-intercept, and then there's also like an x-coordinate, or we'll say the x variable, and there's all this x stuff. Similarly, there's all this y stuff. And so what I've noticed that people do is they start hearing the x and just thinking about the x, and they conflate all of those things that are x things. And so they'll start thinking an x-axis is the same as an x-intercept, is the same as an x variable. And that's not true. So when you're listening and speaking about graphing, it's the second word that tells you what kind of object you're actually dealing with. The first, the x, just tells us we're dealing with it in terms of the x variable. But the second word is what tells us what we're actually dealing with. So make sure you're hearing that and understanding what we're actually talking about when you're saying it, when I'm saying it, when you're reading it from directions and stuff like that.